Hi, and welcome to At the Movies at AMC. I'm John Spurney. We're looking at classic American movies through the lens of genre. And today's film is Stagecoach from 1939, directed by John Ford for United Artists. And so we chose Stagecoach because it is one of the greatest examples of one of the greatest American genres. And I think it's a genre that even people who aren't serious film fans are aware of and understand innately, and that, of course, is the Western. So you probably already know what the Western is and what the Western means, but just for the sake of definition, Westerns are films that are set in the American West, generally in the time between the California Gold Rush of 1849, which was an event that brought many settlers across the country with the promise of easy wealth. And the period kind of ends with the closing of the frontier in 1890. So these are films that take place mostly in the American West in the latter part of the 19th century. And Western films commonly feature protagonists such as cowboys, gunslingers, sheriffs, bounty hunters. And the genre tends to focus on stories that revolve around men. Women really are sort of ancillary to the main action and almost never the protagonists in these films. But I think Stagecoach is a really great and interesting example in that it has several very consequential female characters, most notably, of course, Claire Trevor, who portrays the sex worker Dallas. So by the time Stagecoach was made in 1939, the Western was a very well-established genre in Hollywood already. And in fact, some of the first and most popular films of the silent era were Westerns. And probably the most famous of those is a film called The Great Train Robbery, which was directed by Edwin S. Porter in 1903. And although that was not the first Western, it's generally considered to be the first film to establish what would become the essence of the Western genre in America. In that it's a story of, it takes place in the time period we discussed, but it's also a story of crime and pursuit and retribution, and these all became very common tropes in the genre's heyday. So with the advent of sound in 1927, the Western fell out of favor in Hollywood. They were popular in the silent era, but then when sound came in the early sound era, Westerns were generally made by what were known at the time as the Poverty Row Studios. These were smaller, less successful organizations that primarily made low budget, what we would call B pictures, because they were the second picture on a double feature, which was a very common way that people saw movies in those days. There would be two films on the bill, always newsreels, cartoons. This is before television. So going to the movie theater was your visual entertainment. So movie productions, presentations were longer and than they are now. So the Western fell out of favor in the early sound era, but with the success of Stagecoach and other Westerns of the period, the late 30s, the genre really revived. Stagecoach was not just a critical success, but was also a box office success. And so Westerns became popular again. And the golden age of the Western in America is roughly from 1940 to 1960. Really in the 50s for sure. Like in the 1950s, the number of Western films produced by major Hollywood studios outnumbered all other genres combined. They made many, many Western pictures. And it strikes me as being, the reason Robert Downey Jr. is here is because it strikes me as being somewhat similar to the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe today. There are a lot of Marvel movies, and a lot of movies that get made today are about superheroes. And so that's kind of analogous to the success of the Western in the 1950s, predominantly. So although the genre declined in popularity during the 1960s, Western films remain an integral part of America's really national mythology, even to this day. And I think this is because, the real crux of the Western genre is the idea that America and American democracy grew out of a conflict between the wilderness and civilization. And I think one of the reasons that Stagecoach is the paradigmatic Western is because it really embodies this idea. The stagecoach is a tiny world unto itself, traveling through a wilderness full of obstacles and dangers. And through the course of the journey, as we will discuss, each of the passengers in the stagecoach has an obstacle that they must attempt to overcome. And the story doesn't really reach its conclusion until the passengers finally reach Lordsburg, get out of the wilderness and reach Lordsburg, which is an outpost of civilization, a wild outpost, but civilization nonetheless, at the end of the picture. But I think another reason Stagecoach is such a perfect example of the Western, really embodies the Western genre, is because it was directed by the undisputed master of the genre, John Ford. So John Ford was born in the state of Maine in 1894. His parents were immigrants from Ireland. He was very proud of his Irish heritage. His brother, Francis, became a silent movie star. Francis was his older brother, and Ford traveled to California to follow in his footsteps in 1914 and started as an actor, but he became a very successful director of silent films, including many silent westerns, but only 10 of the more than 60 silent films he made survive. And I think a lot of people don't know this, but almost 95% of all the silent films that were ever made no longer exist. And this is primarily because those films were shot on a different kind of stock, film stock, than modern films. They were shot on nitrate stock, and nitrate stock is highly flammable. So a lot of these films literally went up in flames. And nitrate stock is also has to be treated with great care. And if it's not stored correctly, it literally just turns into jelly. And that's happened to a lot of films. So many silent films that we read about or hear about are gone forever and will never be seen again. And that is true for all but 10 of the 60 silent movies that John Ford made. But by the time in the silent era, but by the time he made Stagecoach in 1939, Ford had become one of the most successful directors in Hollywood and was highly revered by his peers. And in fact, when Orson Welles came to Hollywood to make his first film for RKO in 1939, he had never made a movie before. He was a radio star. And so in order to learn how to make a movie, he claims that he watched Stagecoach more than 40 times. And that taught him everything he needed to know to make his first film. And of course, the first film that he made was Citizen Kane, which is now considered by many people to be the greatest American movie ever made. And so he made that picture in 1941, and by his own admission, Stagecoach was an incredible influence on that movie because Wells had never made a movie before. But John Ford continues to influence directors really to this day, and he was a huge influence on Steven Spielberg. And in fact, in Spielberg's most recent film, which is called The Fabelmans, it's a fictionalized version of how Spielberg became a filmmaker as a kid. The final scene in the movie is Spielberg's recreation of an actual meeting he had with John Ford when Spielberg was a teenager. And Spielberg didn't realize he was in Ford's office until he saw the poster for Stagecoach on the wall. And in the scene, Ford is played by David Lynch, who is another famous director who is highly influenced by Ford. And if you haven't seen this movie, I recommend it. I won't spoil this scene for you, but according to Spielberg, all of the dialogue in this scene is verbatim to what Ford actually said to him during that first meeting. And it's very profane and very funny. So check that out, The Fabelmans. So Ford was very irascible, a very eccentric alcoholic, and he had this very strange habit on set of nervously chewing on a handkerchief when he was shooting. And everybody who works with him talked about, he always had a handkerchief in his mouth that he would chew on as a sort of bizarre, nervous habit. And as I said, he was an alcoholic, but he would never drink while shooting a picture. But upon the completion of one of his movies, he would go on these multi-day benders where he would just get blackout drunk for days on end. And then he would sober up to make the next picture. And while making Stagecoach, he was having an extramarital affair with the actor Katharine Hepburn. And he had met her while directing her in Mary of Scotland in 1936. And a lot of people think this is the period in which Ford made Stagecoach. A lot of people consider his greatest period. And it's kind of a common belief that his relationship with Hepburn had a really positive effect on his creative output, because his golden age creatively coincides with his affair with Hepburn. So one of the sort of key parts of John Ford's Western oeuvre is he shooting movies in Monument Valley in Arizona. And Stagecoach was the first film Ford would shoot in Monument Valley. And as you can see from this picture, the movie is in black and white, and it's amazing, but it doesn't do justice to how beautiful Monument Valley is. And as you can see from this picture, it's a beautiful but kind of forbidding landscape, and it has these enormous red rock formations. And it's really become the iconic landscape for not just the Western film, but I think it really forms the basis of the international conception of the American West itself. I think when non-Americans think of the West, what they're thinking of is Monument Valley. And I can just tell you as an American, for instance, I think a lot of people think Texas looks like this, and it does not. It's a very specific Arizona, New Mexico, Utah is where this kind of beautiful, stark Western landscape exists. And so this is the first movie Ford makes there. And one of the things I think that is sort of the most skillful things in Stagecoach is the way Ford effortlessly cuts between location shots he made in Monument Valley and process shots with actors on a soundstage, literally acting in front of footage of Monument Valley being projected behind them. And if you watch the movie, most shots with dialogue were actually shot in Hollywood on a soundstage. But the sort of skillful cutting between location and soundstage hides this fact. If you look at this sequence, so this is on location. That is, outside in Monument Valley. But once you cut to the close-ups and they're talking, they'll cut to a close. That's on a soundstage, and that's a projection behind him. And you can notice when they cut back, that's on a soundstage with a projection behind him. When they cut away from Wayne, you'll see that the background behind him does not match. There's no tree, it doesn't match where they're shooting. And, there's probably months between the exterior shots and the soundstage shots. And it's so skillfully cut together, it just looks like these guys are having a conversation outside. Another great example in this movie of how Ford used Monument Valley to great effect is the snow sequence. So one day when they were shooting the exteriors, it started to snow, and the crew thought that Ford would cancel the day's work because of the weather, but he actually had them shoot the snowy exteriors. And then when the crew returned to Hollywood, Ford had the movie's screenwriter, Dudley Nichols, add a scene to the picture where the stagecoach takes a mountain pass through snow in order to avoid the Apaches. And that wasn't originally part of the movie. It was literally just added because Ford, got this footage of it snowing in Monument Valley. So when they went back to Hollywood, they added this fake sequence of them driving through the snow. So although the bulk of the movie is in Monument Valley, not all of the exteriors were shot there. And the very famous chase scene where the Apaches attack the stagecoach was actually shot on a dry lake bed near Victorville, California. And this sequence features incredible stunts that were designed and performed by Yakima Canutt, who was one of the greatest stuntmen in Hollywood's sort of golden age. And Canutt performed the incredible stunt in this sequence where one of the Apaches is shot and he passes between the legs of the horses and then underneath the wheels of the train. And Canutt actually got up on purpose when the stunt was done so that people would know, a human being had actually done that stunt and it wasn't just a dummy. And of course, this is long before any kind of CGI. These are real guys jumping on and falling off of real horses and real wagons, traveling at 50 miles an hour. And, people often got very badly hurt doing these stunts. And as I said earlier, Spielberg is a huge fan of John Ford. And Spielberg was such a fan of this sequence and that stunt in particular that he updated it in the first Indiana Jones film. But he updated it so it's a truck instead of a stagecoach. But he loved that, the stunt of going under a vehicle between the wheels. And of course, he adds this gag with the whip, which makes it even more exciting. But, Spielberg has said the entire idea for the sequence came from that one stunt in Stagecoach. So, Ford would return to Monument Valley again and again. He made 10 movies there. And Ford also reused actors. He reused locations and he reused actors. He had a famous stock company of actors that he would use again and again in his pictures. And many of them are in Stagecoach. So Thomas Mitchell, who plays Doc Boone, made 3 films with John Ford. Donald Meek, who plays Mr. Peacock, made 4 films with Ford. Andy Devine, who plays the stagecoach driver Buck, made 5 films with Ford. John Carradine, who plays the gambler Hatfield, made 11 films with Ford. And of course, in one of the longest and most important collaborations between an actor and a director in the history of American cinema, John Wayne made 14 films with John Ford over the course of a relationship that spanned 50 years. And Stagecoach is really the movie that made John Wayne famous. Wayne's real name was Marion Morrison, so you can see why he changed it. He was a football star in college, and he had worked in Hollywood as a stuntman. And like I said, Stagecoach was the movie that made him a star, and he would remain one of the biggest stars in Hollywood for really the next 35 years. But when Wayne made Stagecoach, he really was relatively unknown. And he had been making low-budget Westerns at Republic Pictures, which is one of the Poverty Row studios we talked about earlier, really in relative obscurity for about 10 years. And just to put things into perspective as to where Wayne was in his career when he was hired to make Stagecoach, Claire Trevor, who plays Dallas, was the highest paid actor on the picture. She was paid $15,000 to act in the movie. John Wayne was paid $3,700. And even Tim Holt, who plays the cavalry officer, the army officer who only shows up like 3 times in the movie, he got $5,000. So Wayne was not a big star at the time, but he was friends with Ford, and Ford somehow saw the everyman quality that ultimately made John Wayne a huge star. And Ford tapped him for the role of the Ringo Kid. And, we can see on screen, you can see Ford's enthusiasm for John Wayne, especially in the opening dolly shot that introduces Ringo in the movie, which is really now sort of iconic. And this sweeping camera movement, tells us like this is an important character in our story, but it also works, I think, whether intentionally or not, as the visual signifier of the birth of a new star. It's such an iconic camera move, and for John Ford, kind of a showy one. So there was obviously a lot of purpose behind it. And although, Wayne would become the biggest star out of everybody in the cast of Stagecoach, Stagecoach really is an ensemble picture, which is just a film where multiple characters are important to the story. There's not just one main protagonist. There are multiple stories going on. The screenplay for Stagecoach is incredibly well crafted to take advantage of this ensemble cast. And each character is kind of a societal outsider, really teetering on the fringes of society. And in fact, on the original poster for the movie, the tagline is a powerful story of 9 strange people. And that's really true. Like all of the people in the Stagecoach are outsiders, and they all have an obstacle they need to overcome through the course of the journey. And, interestingly, and to this film's credit, some of them fail. So Mr. Gatewood, the bank president, is attempting to embezzle $50,000 from the bank that he runs, but he's apprehended when the Stagecoach reaches Lordsburg because they fixed the telegraph. Mr. Peacock is attempting to get home to Kansas City, Kansas, but his plans are thwarted because he is injured in an Indian attack. But I think what makes this movie work on an even better level is that several of the obstacles that characters encounter and overcome through the course of the story are specifically intertwined with other characters in the Stagecoach. So, Mrs. Mallory is secretly pregnant, and she risks her own life and the life of her unborn child in order to be reunited with her husband. But Hatfield, the gambler, is pursuing Mrs. Mallory. His amorous pursuit of Mrs. Mallory, ultimately, he loses his life as a result of that. And then similarly, Doc Boone is an alcoholic who's being kicked out of town because of his drinking at the beginning of the picture. But then he proves himself worthy by successfully delivering Mrs. Mallory's baby. And similarly, Dallas is a prostitute who's also being exiled from town at the beginning of the picture. But she proves her worth by caring for Mrs. Mallory after she gives birth. And of course, she falls in love with Ringo, and Ringo is an outlaw who is headed for prison, but he manages to gain revenge by killing the Plummer brothers when they get to Lordsburg. And then he, as a result, he wins his freedom after the marshal lets him go. So he and Dallas can live happily ever after on Ringo's ranch in Mexico. If it wasn't clear to you watching the movie that Dallas is a sex worker, a prostitute, I don't blame you. Stagecoach was made in 1939 when there was a very strict code of censorship self-imposed on Hollywood under the so-called Hays Code, which was named for Will Hays, who was the president of the Motion Picture Association of America. And as you can see from this photo, he doesn't look like a very fun, loving guy. And the set of rules that he put together governed what could and could not be shown or said in all American pictures from 1934 to 1968. 1968 is when America begins the ratings system that still exists to this day. So the fact that Dallas is a sex worker could not be explicitly mentioned. And it never is in the film. nor is the word pregnant ever mentioned in relation to Mrs. Mallory. And I don't know about you, when I saw this movie, it was only when she actually gives birth to her baby that I realized, why she has been in such a delicate condition during her ride on the stagecoach. No one ever says the word pregnant. And so, Dallas's profession as a sex worker has to be inferred from information we get through the story because it could not be explicitly stated under the Hays Code. And so for people who saw this movie in 1939, they were used to movies dropping hints and clues about topics that could not be discussed explicitly in the movie. And they would have picked up on the numerous instances in the film. So for instance, early in the film, the other passengers in the stagecoach refuse to speak to her, or
place, Mrs. Mallory. It's cooler by the window.
They avoid sitting next to her. They literally move away.
Thank you.
Rather than be close to her. And I love when she moves, the banker immediately gets up and moves as well, so they can be as far as possible away from her. And then when the coach finally reaches Lordsburg at the end of the picture, you see her and Ringo walking by, and they're walking by brothels. If you look behind them, there are men propositioning sex workers. And, again, you're just seeing them in the background.
You gotta know where you live, don't I?
And
No, don't come any further.
she doesn't want him to follow her
Open a crazy dream.
to where she works because he'll realize she's a prostitute.
You ain't never gonna say goodbye.
And so they continue on, and in this tracking shot, they're walking, and the background again, specifically, we're seeing brothels in the background. We're in the red light district of Lordsburg, and so you see these houses with people cavorting and playing the piano and drinking, and just again, an audience in 1939 would be like, oh, that's a whorehouse. She is a prostitute. And so this kind of leads to really my favorite scene in the movie. She asks him not to follow her because she doesn't want him to know what she does for a living, but he follows her. And when they get to her brothel, she confronts him.
Well, kid, I told you not to follow me.
And he still wants to marry her. He says, I love that shot too. He's in silhouette.
I asked you to marry me, didn't I?
And this is the moment when she realized he doesn't care what she does for a living, which, I just think is beautiful. And this sets up, of course, the happy ending where Ringo gets his freedom and he and Dallas drive off to live happily ever after on his ranch in Mexico. And there's a beautiful exterior shot. They shot in Monument Valley of them driving off. It's probably not them in the carriage, but it's a beautiful shot and a great end to a great movie. So, I always try to recommend further viewing in the genre we're talking about. These are kind of, I think, the best classic American Westerns, and not surprisingly, two of them are John Ford pictures. So The Searchers from 1956 is a John Ford picture, also starring John Wayne. And it's a great movie about a man who is trying to find a woman who was abducted by Indians. And it's a very dark picture, and Wayne is great in it. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance from 1962 stars Jimmy Stewart. That's another John Ford movie. Highly recommended. High Noon, I think for many Americans, is kind of the quintessential Western, and stars Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly in one of her first roles. one of the really great things about High Noon that makes it a very interesting picture is it takes place in real time. So it's about, the hour and a half leading up to a gunfight that's supposed to happen at noon. And the hour and a half takes an hour and a half of screen time. It all happens in real time. Red River and Rio Bravo are both Howard Hawks pictures. So we're going to be looking at some Howard Hawks movies later. Howard Hawks was not known really predominantly as a Western director, but he made two really great Western movies. So Red River also stars John Wayne and the Montgomery Cliff, and that's a great movie. And Rio Bravo is kind of a little more updated, light-hearted Western with Dean Martin. And it's a good picture. So I recommend all these movies if you want to see some more classic American Westerns. So, we look at a classic example of a genre, and then we look at a modern example of the genre. So the modern Western we're going to be looking at is 1992's Unforgiven, which was directed by and stars Clint Eastwood, who was himself a great star of the Western genre as an actor before becoming really one of the great American directors of the past 50 years. And it features great performances by Eastwood, but also Gene Hackman and Morgan Freeman are in it. And it is it's a modern revisionist spin on the Western genre. Some people went as far as to call it an anti-Western. It's a much darker film than Stagecoach, and it's similar to the revisionist spin we saw in the film noir genre when we compared Double Indemnity to Chinatown. It's kind of a similarly negative spin on the genre. So we're going to talk about that film on December 16th. So please watch Unforgiven before December 16th, and we'll be here on December 16th to discuss it. And I look forward to it. I look forward to watching that movie again. It's a great movie. Okay, so now if people have any questions, I would be happy to take some questions. So someone asks, some parts of Stagecoach are reminiscent of theater. Can you talk more about how directors like John Ford approached the transition between stage and screen in the early days of cinema? That's a very insightful question, because especially if you watch silent films really are just filmed plays. The language of cinema, and certainly the language of the moving camera, had to be developed over the course of time. And I think Stagecoach feels a little bit like a play because the action is circumscribed by the interiority of the stagecoach itself. And most of the scenes take place in this tiny little space inside the stagecoach. And even when they leave the stagecoach, they tend to go into more confining spaces, like when they have dinner at that restaurant. They stop at these kind of little inns along the way, stopping places. But they're always kind of indoors. And but the interesting thing is that environment is, I think, really brilliantly contrasted in the film with all those super wide shots of the tiny stagecoach moving through this, Monument Valley, this huge, expansive wilderness. And so you really get the feeling, whether you're conscious of it or not, of small people, being swallowed up by this enormity around them. And I think, Ford had started in the silent era, so he kind of moved through the whole history. And, the silent films of his you can see are like other silent films, and they're essentially, plays shot on film, and just the frame acts like the proscenium arch acts in a theater. But by the time he makes this movie, there are a lot of great in that sequence where they ford the river, the stagecoach goes across a river. He placed a camera it's essentially the point of view shot of whoever's driving the stagecoach. So you see the horses in front of you and move into the water, and that's a great sequence. And similarly, this film has a lot of low angle shots where the camera is very low to the ground. And I think of the sequence where Ringo shoots the brothers, and he drops to the ground to shoot them, and the camera is on ground level, so he basically falls to the level where the camera is. So by the time this film was made, Ford had learned, and I think everybody in Hollywood had learned, how to move the camera and how to make cinema different than just a filmed play. Excuse me. And you see this at the very, very tail end of the silent era. The sort of last great silent films that were made even when sound already existed. So like 1927, 1928, there are still these amazing films being made, like The Crowd by King Vidor, or Sunrise by F.W. Murnau. And those films have a lot of moving camera, a lot of very modern camera movement and special effects. And by that time, directors had really learned how to make cinema its own language. And the irony is, with the coming of sound in 1927, the technology at that time was so rudimentary that you couldn't move the camera because you couldn't move the microphone. They just hadn't figured out how to do it yet. So early sound films, 1927, 1928, really oddly revert back to the filmed play feeling of early silent films, because for technical reasons, you couldn't move the camera. But obviously by the time this film is made, they had figured out technically how to do it. And that's why this film is so interesting visually. And, this film has all those shots on location. And I think the fact that what's really interesting in the film, as I said before, is just the contrast between the tiny inside of the stagecoach and the vast wilderness of Monument Valley. All right, so thank you so much for watching. And as I said, our next film is Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood. And please watch that film, and we'll be back on December 16th to discuss that film. Thanks.